Hello everybody and welcome to the panel today on investing in resilience. I'm Kate Bromley, I'm Head of Responsible Investment at QIC, and I also have the pleasure of being the current chair for the IGCC Physical Risk and Resilience Working Group. I'd like to also just thank our session sponsor for this session, which is Stockland. So on the subject of climate resilience, the climate is changing and we are seeing a steady rise in the number of natural disasters occurring. We're seeing shifts in weather patterns. And along with that, we are seeing an increase in insurance payouts. We're seeing an increase in uninsured losses. And we're also seeing greater impacts on the communities that we operate in and also on businesses. So along with our panel today, we are going to be discussing investing in resilience from a range of different perspectives. So please let me introduce our well-qualified panel. To my immediate right, we have Mark Crossweller, AFSM, former head of the National Resilience Task Force, Department of Home Affairs. We also have joining us Amy Hogan, head of sustainability at Stockland. And out there on the wing, we have Michael Salvatico, Executive Director and Head of MSCI ESG Research Australia, MSCI. So thank you very much for joining us today, guys. Now, as we do have such a diverse range of panellists, I thought we might begin by speaking a little from each of our perspectives on exactly what physical climate risk means to each of us and what resilience actually means. So I might start with you, Amy, if I can.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you for inviting me to join this esteemed panel. I guess if I could take a step back and just give some context around who Stockland is, if there are some in the audience that aren't familiar with our organisation. We're Australia's largest diversified real estate company in the country. And to give, I guess, a frame, we have about $15.3 billion worth of real estate under management. We have 84 families move into our residential communities every week. We have over 11,000 residents that call our retirement living villages their home. Over 390,000 shoppers every day come into our retail town centres. And we have over 3,000 commercial property tenants. So you can imagine through that scale and that diversity, and particularly the fact that our communities play such important roles in those spaces, that we've been considering and recognising climate risk and opportunities for quite a long period of time. Climate change has implications on the design and operations of our assets, and it influences how we procure and how we use energy. It also has long-term impacts on our customers and communities. So in terms of our approach at Stockland, back in 2006 we established a climate change action plan, which really gave us some leverage to focus a lot on energy efficiency originally, particularly in our retail portfolio. We have seen since then a 57% reduction in our emissions intensity, and we've saved over $106 million in utility bills, which obviously benefits Stockland, but it also benefits directly our tenants. About 8 years ago, we implemented our climate adaptation strategy, which then gave us the opportunity to do a national exposure mapping exercise, identifying our vulnerable assets across the country, which gave us a really good opportunity to focus on those priority assets, which we felt needed some direct attention. I think it's really important to note that there is an absence of industry tools across the property sector. And so with that absence, Stockland has spent many years now working with ACOM, who are a leading consultant in this space, to develop a group-wide tool that we can use to identify vulnerabilities within our assets and our communities, that also identifies the nuances, very minor nuances sometimes, across our different asset classes. So that's really exciting, and up until now we've done over 80 climate and community resilience assessments across our suite of assets. And we're also very proud that for FY19 financial year, we released our second full-year TCFD response. So that's, I guess, some background to Stockland.
Thank you, Amy. Mark, could I please pose the same question to you? How are you thinking about physical resilience from your perspective?
Complex. From a government level, I think heading up, when I was asked to head up the task force, I'd headed up as Director General of Emergency Management Australia for almost 6 years, and the government asked me to head up a task force on resilience at the national level, which I was very happy to do. And the first place we went to, in fact, was risk reduction, because I came to understand that resilience is critical. I've got to say, it's important. But it's a bit like in the climate debate that if you don't decarbonise and reduce emissions, then adaptation becomes near impossible. It's the same in the disaster space, that if you don't reduce risk, then resilience becomes near impossible. And there's a bias on resilience narratives in politics, in community, that continues to push the individual to be resilient. And then if you look at the systemic resilience, it isn't there, or it's not where it needs to be. So it wasn't very popular when I started because everyone wanted to race down the road of resilience, and I said, look, yes, we need to do that, but there's got to be a balance here of the equities. So I think there's 6 things that are unprecedented for us in Australia and largely the world. I don't think we're atypical in this regard, but the increasing intensities and frequencies of natural hazards, we're experiencing that now. The north coast of New South Wales and southern Queensland. I remember I started in the business 35 years ago, and about 20 years ago we started talking about fire in the Australian landscape in places that hadn't experienced it previously. And I was at a ministerial council meeting in New Zealand of Australian and New Zealand ministers about 3 or 4 years ago, and I remember a jurisdictional minister just to the north of New South Wales saying that bushfires were not a problem for them and wouldn't be. And I was flabbergasted at the short-sightedness of the politics at the time, that science had been saying and community had been saying for a long time, look, you need to prepare for these things. So exposures are greater than ever before. I think we heard a little bit this morning about the population increases in Australia. It's basically a city the size of Canberra every year for the next 30 years will need to be built. That pushes out into exposures. The long-term nature of disaster and the conflation with the Northern Hemisphere. So we used to draw a lot of resource from the US, particularly aviation resource in combating wildfire in Australia. That's not available to us now because we're in conflict and competition with those resources to the north. Our systemic independence and interconnectedness. So if I was to, particularly to the millennials, I think they call them, my kids are millennials, I think, but if I was to take their phone off them for 2 weeks, how would they feel about it? Well, they'd probably disown me, but our connection to technology and the interconnectedness of technology is also unprecedented. The extent to which we understand that is actually quite limited. Talking to some major telcos when I was heading up the task force, one of them, senior executives, admitted that they understood their network well, but they did not understand what hung off it and what that network, how critical that network was to broader society. So these are all new in terms of strategic issues and contemplations, and how we contextualise them is challenging, and the rate of change is extraordinary. And so I think it's a very challenging world in the space of resilience. So obviously we'll unpackage this as we go through, Kate, but risk reduction is kind of fundamental in the space of crisis, and any business or investor would need to take an interest in where, not only how can I be resilient or how can my investments be resilient, but what's happening with risk reduction. We have embedded risk in the Australian landscape that we still don't know enough about. So it's embedded and it's entrenched on the Australian landscape, and we are continuing to do it. And so I say to any investor, absolutely resilience, very important, but have a look through the lens of risk reduction and make sure there's something happening there as well.
Thank you, Mark. Michael, could I put the same question to you, please?
Thanks, Kate. And thanks for the introduction too. I thought just to add some context, and for those who I don't know, to give a little bit more background on MSCI, because some people might think of us as an index company. That's where we started. but we also have expertise in risk assessment, scenario analysis, real estate, and environmental social governance research, which is the reason that I'm here. When I think about resilience, Kate, I think about it from three perspectives, three ways that we work with our clients, and that's really around a framework to approach resilience, the company, the bottom-up analysis, company and industry level analysis, and then the scenario analysis, so looking into the future and assessing the risks and bringing those back to a value, a present value. The framework is essential. We work mostly with investors, so we're rating companies, including Stockland. We're also assessing sovereign risks. We're looking at country risk. We're looking at state risk as well, to different aspects, including some from a physical risk perspective, like natural resources. When we're working with our investor clients, they're looking at how to analyse the climate risk based on one of either two objectives, and that is a belief and a value around building a better world or around building a more resilient portfolio. And that's the same whether you're looking at transition risk or physical risk. Within those categories are three levers available to investors, and that is risk mitigation, stewardship, and investment in disruptors and opportunities. Again, same for physical risk. Depending on how you move those levers or how you adjust them will depend on whether you're more tilted towards a better world or a more resilient portfolio. In terms of the bottom-up analysis, the company-level analysis, we're investigating companies based on thousands of exposure metrics, many of them which include climate risk-related metrics. Some of the key issues that we're assessing are climate risk vulnerability, and when we're weighting our key issues, we're looking into the longer-term risks around the physical risks that companies are exposed to. I thought one of the things that to add to the panel as well is really to think about the physical risks in terms of the type of risks that investors face or companies face through their assets around their acute risks, whether that's storms or floods or fires, or the more chronic risks through sea level rise, for instance, and heat rise. When we're investigating them from a bottom-up perspective and looking at companies, we're partnering with organisations through geospatial mapping, and we're able to point to research in our industry reports that our clients use to assess whether it's an Australian industry report identifying over 30% of Australian real estate exposed to storms, or whether it's a UK-based assessment looking at the entire country and breaking it into different sections and identifying that 35% of the value at risk for buildings in Lewisham is at flood risk. Or whether it's a US-based report that identifies 3,800 facilities out of the over 15,000 facilities we look at, again, are at high risk from floods. To round that up, the third part we look at is the scenario analysis, and that's very challenging in itself. So it's a top-down view of physical risk, and that involves a scientific approach. If you think about the challenges, it's how the winds are affecting the waves in the ocean, which are hitting the coastline. It's around sea level rise, which is different depending on where you are. I don't know if anyone here saw a recent report from Joelle Gurgis, who's one of our local scientists. We don't just need to have scientists come over from the US to show us that we're pretty smart here in Australia. But she points to a 17 centimetre sea level rise in Darwin. So sea level rises at different levels in different places. We need to take this into our modelling. And so essentially through the scenario analysis, we're using those metrics to understand the impact on individual assets, calculating that out into the future, bringing that back into a present value, and we're able to assess that at a portfolio level for our investor clients.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, guys. That gives us a lot to dig into. Now, we've heard over the last day or so that climate forecast modelling is very much an evolving space. And Dr. Michael Eman told us this morning that uncertainty is not our friend. So with that in mind, it would be good to put it to the panel. What is the state of resilience assessment currently? Where are we at and how are we going? And again, Amy, I might start with you if I can.
Thank you. I've got a choice of two. Look, I think resilience assessments, I think it's really important to appreciate that they actually do work. We have some great examples within Stockland where we have centres, let's focus on our retail town centres in North Queensland, who we know after conversations, many conversations with insurers are located in areas of potential catastrophic events due to cyclonic activity. Townsville, as an example, was in January 2019 this year with all of the flooding, very well equipped to respond to that event. Since 2013, we've conducted 4 climate resilience assessments at that centre, and each year have made improvements based on actions that we've identified. And so the centre team were incredibly proactive early this year to support the local community, to implement the cyclone management plan, and as a result, have been awarded through the Australian Business Continuity Institute a national award for their response, which is really fantastic. And I think it shows that assessments do work, and the effort that we put into those assessments and the complexity around the modelling that forms the tool is really important. Another, I think, it's really, if we can kind of have a bit of a chat about community resilience, because that's a fundamental part of our approach to looking at resilience in its entirety. A great example is Cyclone Yazi back in 2011, which saw Stockland Cairns become a makeshift cyclone bunker. We had over 3,000 local community members seek refuge, mums and dads, grandparents, families, local services, for a couple of days, and you can just imagine the pressure that a large number of people spending a very long time, 24 hours a day, placed on the shopping centre, and it was a real eye-opener for Stockland, and certainly set the scene for how we respond to community and community needs. And it's also really important to recognise that community resilience differs depending on asset class, and so if you think of the experience up in Cairns with the shopping centre, we also own a number of retirement villages down in South Australia, and so through our mapping exercise, which we undertake and review annually, identified that SA, particularly in Adelaide, is vulnerable to extreme heat days. And not just one extreme heat day, but 8 in a row. And so if you have retirement living village residents living in our villages, that can have significant health and wellbeing impacts on them. We, as part of our community resilience process, conduct focus groups. A lot of our residents have been living in those villages for quite some time, so they're actually eyewitnesses to extreme weather events, and they can sit down and actually tell us directly, how did the village respond to that event that happened 10 years ago? And we know through those conversations that residents, when it's really, really hot, some of them actually sit inside their homes. They don't like to turn the air conditioning on because they'd like to save some money. They actually close the doors, shut the curtains, and just sit inside and wait for it to cool down. And that in itself is an issue. So it's really important, I think, when we think about assessments, we also consider the community as part of that process.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. And with the community resilience aspect in mind, Mark, I wonder if you had any thoughts on where assessment currently is at from that perspective.
So it's really good to hear a big part of my job in the last 18 months is the public-private interface, and it's underdone, to be straight up about it. It needs to do a lot more needs to be done in that space. Governments have tended to hold on to this space because it's kind of politically astute to do so. So it's quite populist to be in the space of resilience, and it's very difficult to get a government to give up some of its equities of knowledge and so on and so forth in this space. So the reason I say that is that the advice I used to give when I was a commissioner of emergency services to particularly the elderly people on days of catastrophic fire weather was go shopping. It was literally go and hunt the bargains, go and have a cup of tea, or go to the movies. In other words, get out of harm's way. And the fact that a shopping centre or a portfolio investment company or property can see itself in community is kind of fundamental, and is, I think, a key to part of the success going forward. I've had pushback from some private sector companies who want the government to pay for enhancement of infrastructure to provide that service, and I had to push back and say, look, it's not really appropriate to do that, but that was in the vast minority, and I think that this is a social problem as much as it is an economic one. We cannot underestimate where society is at in terms of its capacity to be resilient as an individual, as I mentioned in my opening address. When people stay inside their home and close the curtains and shut out the world, particularly in bushfire-prone areas, they are sitting ducks because they can't see what's happening on the outside. And there's many stories told of the Victorian fires in 2009 of people doing exactly that, not realising what was happening outside because they'd had to close off the world. So we're living in a society that's more individualised than it's ever been for a whole host of drivers, political and otherwise. And if we can work together, public and private, if we understand that and can contextualise it and work together to kind of break that down a bit, I think everybody wins from it. Our premise in the task force was to underpin public policy with a premise of the reduction of human suffering. In other words, to introduce and to take New Zealand's lead on kindness, well-being and empathy, as the Prime Minister does in New Zealand, was to take a compassionate lens to crisis and to resilience and say, look, that's part of our shared humanity, really. And I think that's what climate's trying to say to us. If I was to personify or mythologise the climate, she's kind of saying, look, you've got a chance here to come together and sort this thing out. In my world of in briefing in politics, the problem with climate is it is so polarised between the far left and the far right that anyone who sits in the centre, which most people actually do, either keep their head down because it's too difficult to navigate, or get pulled to the left or to the right in order to take a side. And climate's bigger than that. It's more fundamental, and I think so. So I encourage any narrative between public and private sector that moves to greater good, moves to well-being, moves to a reduction of human suffering, moves in that context, then moves to market opportunity, investment opportunities and so on and so forth. And my PhD is on this in part, but I'm yet to see why those ethics are counterintuitive or contrary to good investment. I just can't see it. And it's often purported that if you take the path of virtue or the path of good or the path of right, that's going to cost you money. My strong suggestion is that by not doing that, it's costing us an absolute fortune, particularly in terms of loss. And we haven't even talked about loss today, but loss is very narrowly viewed in governments around economic loss, and I can tell you the greatest losses are the non-commensurables. And if we can get a handle on what those things look like in society by providing facilities in resilience for people to come along and seek shelter, then that economic benefit and that societal benefit is enormous. But because we only view loss in a very narrow context, we're not picking up on the subtleties of what's really important to people. And that's critical to resilience. It's kind of fundamental.
Thanks, Mark. And just staying with you for a moment, Mark, I wondered if you could build on some of your points there, and particularly with regards to what you're seeing in some of the emerging government frameworks and government sector responses to build resilience, particularly with regards to critical infrastructure, critical systems, and what are some of the challenges that you're seeing?
I'll start with the challenges. I think most governments take a multi-hazard approach, an all-hazards approach to crisis and resilience, and there's a big divide down the middle between climate on one side and national security on the other. And so you've got two fundamental environments of information. One is a need to share environment, and the other one is a need to know environment. And I think that in a structural sense, that the difficulty for governments is that they tend to put that divide down the middle, and critical infrastructure is right in the middle of it, of course. So we talked briefly about cyber this morning. Cyber is complex, and it is entirely human-caused. It's motivated, it's intentioned and motivated by politics and societies of different values. So it tends to dominate. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. And climate, in a policy sense, in a political sense, can often be subordinated in that context if you leave it in national security, in the national security space. I think the opportunities, we released some work on Australia's vulnerability profile in June this year, and thanks to IGCC, and particularly to Emma and Crystal and others who helped us to shape that, was really about having a profound look at vulnerability from a systemic point of view, critical infrastructure and systemic point of view, and its connectivity with human values, what's important to us as a society. And it had never been done before. And when we went to walk down this path, politically very difficult, because to talk about vulnerability is to imply failure or exposure, but we did it nonetheless. And I think what we're able to show is that critical infrastructure is fundamentally, interdependently connected to what it is that's valuable to us. And it changes the narrative, and it opens up the opportunity for critical infrastructure providers to take a more social context to the issue, and it gives a space for government and its politics to come in on behalf of its constituency. And politics is it's an interesting thing. It's not a rational process, but it's not irrational either. It's a non-rational process. It ultimately goes where the sentiment goes. It used to lead on that, of course. It now follows it. But so I think the challenges are not letting climate fall into national security, because it'll get swallowed. I think the opportunities are to take a broader view, looking at some of these frameworks around vulnerability, extending knowledge about those things and pushing those into the resilient space, and then responding accordingly.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Now, a little bit of a shift in gear, and this is an open question to the panel. How and why is physical risk different to transition risk, and what are your thoughts around that?
So, from an investor perspective, and thinking about it through corporates, the transition risks are captured as those from either a change in technology or a change in regulation. And those changes in technology and regulation will potentially lead to perhaps a pricing of carbon. And that pricing of carbon will affect those companies that are then liable to pay for that price and their valuation. There seems to be a lot more focus on transition risk at the moment, and that's because it's a risk that could occur at any time. It could be in the next few days, or in the next few months, or next few years. And so investors are viewing that like they do any risk in their portfolio, and their goal is to understand how exposed they are to a transition risk, and that can be calculated. Whereas the physical risk is the risk on an asset, or as Mark was saying, in infrastructure, the roads that we use, is the material on the roads we use sufficient? Will it bear a heat change? We're the same with rail. Can trains run on rails during particular heat waves? Or power lines and transition lines, if anyone's been following what's been happening with PG&E in California. They literally shut down, on purpose, supplying power because of the temperatures and their uncertainty around their equipment operating in that temperature. And the reason they were uncertain is because there was a tragic bushfire recently and a couple of years ago. And so this was all the bottom-up analysis that we were bringing into our ESG ratings when we looked at PG&E as a risk and flagging that to our investor clients. The question you asked before too, Kate, was also interesting. Are we prepared for resilience? That's the question we get asked all the time, and whether that's a question around our clients asking us for the proportion of real estate in their portfolio subject to flooding, or the proportion of their portfolio subject to water stress, or how well prepared are the companies in their portfolio to deal with climate risk, with the physical risk. Are they assessing their assets? Are they attempting to mitigate the risks? This reminds me back to a report that we wrote on Australian REITs, and I'll just say, with Amy sitting beside me, that Australian REITs are exceptionally good. Some of the best in the world, global best practice in managing their ESG risks. And they're assessing physical risks. A discussion I was having recently with a REIT was, what happens to elevators in an emergency? Elevators in a building in an emergency tend to go straight to the basement. If your emergency is a flood risk and your basement's flooded, everyone in that elevator is going to end up straight down the bottom. And so it's being aware of these things, assessing them and bringing them into your future risk management. Another area that I wanted to touch on, talking about readiness for or resilience, is risks that you might not think of when you're looking at physical risk. You think of things like energy or buildings, but we recently wrote a report on tailings dams, especially after the disaster in Samarco and the following disaster with the Vale. Tailings dams are under more stress now because of climate change. There's more water because of increased rainfall going into these tailings dams, which is causing stress on the tailings dams. The mines themselves are less rich in the minerals that they were originally positioned to extract. So there's more waste material going into the tailings dams as well. It all combines together to create a greater risk that investors need to be aware of.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to touch now on investor tools. And Amy, you've mentioned the resilience framework that you have developed to assess resilience to physical impacts across your portfolios. Are there any other frameworks or research or analysis that you use or you found particularly helpful in understanding resilience across your portfolio?
In all honesty, probably no. Not yet, anyway. The Australian property industry is quite a tight-knit group of people, particularly the sustainability professionals. And while we're very competitive, we're also very collaborative. And so we're working through the Property Council of Australia and its members, our close relationship with the Green Building Council of Australia, to understand how we can leverage the really great work that not just Stockland have done, but some of our peers like Lendlease and Vicinity, to sort of determine a commonality between all of our organisations, and to then also have an understanding as to what's happening cross-sector, because climate change isn't a property, it's not a Stockland problem, it's not a property problem, it's a world problem. So trying to get some leverage and harmonise in that manner. I know that the Green Building Council at the moment is through their future focus consultation with their new tools, is certainly keeping resilience at the front of mind, and there will be minimum requirements within the new tools around resilience. Davina Rooney, who's the CEO of the GBCA, has been conducting an international peer review to understand what is best practice. So that's a really exciting piece of work, which will no doubt feed into the work that we'll be doing across the industry itself. And also GRESB. GRESB has an optional resilience module, which I would hope will become not so optional in the future. And so, in the longer term, I would expect that all of these really important stakeholders come together to develop something which appreciates the uniqueness of our individuality, but also enables investors to make really smart decisions around the resilience of the communities and the assets that we operate.
Thanks, Amy. Now, before we turn to the audience for questions, I wanted to touch on the barriers to building resilience, but also where we see the opportunities to invest in resilience going forward. I wonder if I could start with you, Mark, to sort of talk to the barriers that you see and opportunities.
I think they're kind of one of the same. Because there's so much risk embedded on the Australian landscape at the moment, at some point in time we're going to have to face it and deal with it. The challenge is political, and knowledge of risk in Australia is getting better. But if I take you back to the Queensland floods in 10-11, and if you were to assess the inquiry reports about that flooding, 46% of the recommendations pertain to an absence of knowledge, and 39% to an absence of controls, risk control. In other words, the exercise of regulatory power. So risk was hidden on the landscape. Now, risk is independent of knowledge, of course. It sits there whether we know about it or not. We're getting better at finding out about it. Sometimes we attenuate it for political purposes or what have you, but it's turning up nonetheless, and what climate change tends to do, it flushes it out and says, well, whether you want to know about it or not, here it is. So I think there are barriers there politically. The opportunities are, I think, if government can bring its equities to the table with the private sector, particularly banking and insurance, and look at ways of leveraging value from that mitigation opportunity, then kind of everybody wins. And there are pathways to do that. It takes a lot of political will to do it, and it takes a lot of policy innovation, but it's possible. And you can see the generation of value by mitigating certain aspects of the landscape. It's simply around property prices as an example, but there are other aspects of value that turn up when you seek to proactively mitigate. The only barrier really is the narrative that we take into the space and the political will. And there are certain parts of Australia where I think that would be politically sensible to do it, and I think there are other parts at the moment where you wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. But if we can, and we kind of know where some of them are, if we can liberate the narratives and the conversations in those communities about what's possible, and then move them over time to a more sensible narrative about what we can do about it. And some of that is predicated upon, and here's the biggest challenge, it's what we call, at least in academic terms, it's called anticipated history. And what it means, so all risk is anticipated future, so you're trying to work out what the future looks like and do something about it if you don't like what it looks like. But often we go as far as looking at what it could do, and we stop, and we don't keep going to work out what might be lost. And in that process of what might be lost, what is truly valuable and what is not, what is tradable and what is not. And the irony is that when you go through a crisis, you've got to find that out anyway, because that's what happens. So if you can find that out before you get there, before it happens, you'd be surprised how much value turns up in that assessment about mitigating. Because community says, we really value that thing. And they're motivated to do something about keeping that thing of value. So if I take you to Yarloop in WA and the fires in 2014, I think, or 2015, the community refused to go back into the township until the war memorial was rebuilt. Now, nobody knew it was even valuable because no one had asked the question, but the community knew about it. And the thing you'll find with notions of value is that sometimes they certainly change after you've been through a crisis. You thought you valued this, you realised you valued that. So that can be challenging. But there are mechanisms, narratives and ways of going into communities and talking through those things and then coming back and saying, well, guess what we found? A whole bunch of value, commensurable and non-commensurable, we didn't know about, that we can work with.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest challenge in resilience. No one's doing it at the moment. I think it needs to be done. And I think it's quite exciting, but it does need a politics of some courage, but also of sensibility, I think, and a partnership or a willingness between private sector and governments to do something about it. And there are seeds of that happening at the moment, but they need a lot more nurturing, I think.
For sure. And how do you think, Mark, we begin those conversations? I know you said the seeds of it are emerging, but what do you think it takes practically to draw out that knowledge?
So I think If you take climate, was it the what is it? Climate revolution? What is it? Rebellion?
Extinction Rebellion.
I'm going to get myself into trouble here, but anyway. So look, and I'm a great supporter for climate change. Don't get me wrong, but I'm concerned about catastrophic narratives used to incentivise politics because it polarises at the same time. And so the world I've been in, my job for years was to brief the Prime Minister on worst possible case scenarios that the government might have to respond to. And I was able to develop narratives that were sensible but somewhat confronting. So I think the biggest challenge is how do you craft the narratives to take people in safely and bring them back safely. So it is a catastrophic risk society we live in. You know, those potentialities exist in real terms. There needs to be a narrative that goes with them. But the last thing we want to do is scare people. And I can tell you now that catastrophic narratives for political purposes don't work. They just polarise. So we've got to cut through all that. And the sensible centre needs to come forward and say, you know, to the left and to the right, cool your heels, and let's have a sensible conversation about potentiality. Why? Because neither you nor I wants to suffer. And that's the whole basis of a compassionate society, that if you stop and think about it, I don't want to suffer any more than you do on anything, really. Mm-hmm. And that's why this morning we talked about an intergenerational ethic. There it is, front and centre. It's front and centre. It's a more compassionate society. And we need to build our confidence and our competence about how to have those conversations in public policy, in industry, in investment, that genuinely, as pragmatically as possible, responds to that premise. And get better at it over time. We'll be completely useless at it when we start because we're not conditioned for it. But I would say keep going. Give ourselves permission to make mistakes along the way and keep going. And it works. I've seen it work. We've trialled it. But it does take courage. It takes political will and it takes community leadership. And I think the notion of hero leadership, you know, send the white Anglo-Celtic mid-50s male in to fix the problem, God look at me, is just not the answer. It really isn't. It's a community response. It's a relational leadership problem.
Yeah.
It's a shared ethic of concern and compassion, and then the equities of knowledge and motivation and intention by everybody to move it forward. And if you can promote that, then we get somewhere. But this heroic notion of paternalistic, interventionist leadership isn't going to work. You're seeing the whole world push against that. You're also seeing some politicians in the world still modelling it. But I'll put the microphone down now, otherwise I'm going to get in trouble.
Thank you, Mark. Brilliant answer. Look, just mindful of time, I am going to now throw to the audience to see if we have any questions. I think we've got time for one or two.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the discussion, and I'm particularly interested in some of the developments that are going on in moving away from undertaking risk assessments to just understand the problem, to actually risk assessments that are solution-oriented. And there's a lot of developments going on in this area, and I'm wondering to what extent you're seeing the tools that are being adopted within the investors industry actually picking up on some of these. These tools are actually embracing uncertainty rather than seeing it as an enemy. It is a way of making much more robust decisions. So I'm wondering if you're seeing some of these being developed and brought in to the tools that are being used.
Thank you very much for your question. You didn't say your name or where you're from.
Sorry. My name is Roger Street. I'm actually been heavily involved in adaptation for over 40 years. And I'm currently working with CSIRO here for a period of time.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for that, and thank you for your question. There are tools available that are focused on opportunities as well as risks that our clients have been demanding for a long time. So it's a very positive sign from the investment community. When I say our clients, that's the superannuation funds in Australia and more broadly with MSCI around the world. The reports that we produce look at the risks from a bottom-up perspective, from both transition and physical risk. Probably more interested in the physical risk side, given your focus on adaptation. The physical risk side is more of a challenge. As I say, the focus has been on transition, but that's not to say that physical risk has been put aside. The challenge with physical risk has been to assess it systematically. And so we have a long history of working with clients on industry reports, or looking at particular companies or particular themes, like I mentioned, tailing dams or the fires in California. On the REIT side, one of the reports we put out looked at the impact of increased heat on office workers. One, productivity goes down as the temperatures go up. That's a negative. And two, the costs go up for air conditioning and for running the building. So bringing all these into the analysis might seem negative at the beginning. It might, you've identified a risk, but it's then what are the investments in the disruptors or ways to better cool the building or put the building in a better location. I'll mention Lend-Lease and when they built their head office down on Sussex Street, they used the natural wall, the sandstone wall, as a cooling effect to reduce their overall cooling costs. So seeing more of that come into play comes about because we've identified the risk in the first place.
We Task Force released a document around strategic risk guidance at the end of June. Deals exactly with the matters you raised. So ambiguity, complexity and uncertainty, front and centre in the risk guidance. So we actually developed method and approach and tools and further reading and advice as to how to navigate those complexities. It takes the challenge to public and private sector around persistence, adaptation or transformation. And they are, again, you move straight to politics when you talk about those things. Persistence is easier with kind of hold ground. Adaptation is, make a change and lift the building up or something to cope with the water, and transformation is basically get out of the space, for example. So we developed framings around that very intentionally on behalf of the government as a task force to put those decision-making capabilities into society. Because politics will tend to pull away from them. Politics will tend to want to persist. People are very entrenched in sense of place, for example. You need a compelling argument to move most people. And if you've ever worked in community, you'll know that sense of place is fundamental to a lot of people. So how do you prosecute arguments that can move to adaptation or move to transformation that communities might be reluctantly or otherwise prepared to go with. So it's the government recognised that and did something about it. So it wasn't just rhetoric for us. We actually provided the guidance. It's a 200-page document that will put you to sleep in about 10 minutes, but it's worth a read. So.
Look, I think we may have time for one very quick one before lunch, and I apologise, I can't see very well, but I can see a lady with a hand up over there.
Hi, thanks. This is one from Mark. It's Olivia Kemmer from Energetics here. You mentioned sort of in passing that you wouldn't want to see climate risk fall into the national security bucket. And I'm interested in understanding more about why that would be, because sometimes I think that if it were considered a national security risk, we'd be having a very different conversation that might be useful in some ways.
Yeah, I probably breached some protocols by saying that. So lucky I'm on sabbatical at the moment. So, look, I think the reality is that climate is a security issue. There's no doubt about that. And if you take it on a global scale and at a macro level risk, it is absolutely a securitisation issue. But I guess I'm coming at it from a bureaucratic or cultural perspective that the world of national security is necessarily classified. And by virtue of classification, it means that some things don't get spoken about unless you're cleared to speak to them or unless you need to know about them. And that's just the nature of the world in which we live. That can ironically put controls in place or attenuate or amplify risk, depending upon what agenda is running at the time. I'm moving into political science now, so it's not a Labor-Liberal thing, it's political science. The thing I've always advocated for in the climate space is that everyone has a right to know. That absolutely has a right to know. It's fundamental to who we are. Like, you know, the relationship with the landscape of the atmosphere is what keeps us alive. It's kind of fundamental. So I'm probably letting you into my world a little bit and some of my professional, personal frustrations of the complexities of government and politics and knowledge and how you keep communities safe, trying to balance those equities of need to know, need to share. And climate, unfortunately, has the privilege of being in the space of need to share. And therefore we need to know as much about, everybody needs to know as much about it as possible. Will you all ever get to know everything you want to know about cyber or terrorism? Probably not, unless you're cleared for classification. So therefore we've got to place greater trust in the governments that lead you on these matters. And you should do too. I'm not saying you shouldn't. But climate, I think, is at another level. It really is. It's just at another level. I mean, we put a lot of effort into national security issues and securitising society and keeping them safe, and as I said, so we should, and I have no criticism in that space whatsoever, but climate is just a whole different magnitude when it comes to global effect, as are natural hazards. They affect many more people and kill many more people than terrorism or anything else does. So.
Indeed.
Can we keep that in the room? Is that all right? Are we videoing this?
Look, we have well and truly edged into lunchtime, so we might leave it there. Please join me in thanking our panel.